So this is Lecture 7 of 8-part lecture series by Rabbi Lawrence Troster on Josephus, historian, hero, and traitor. And we're continuing our discussion from last week of Josephus's Theology of History. And we looked at the various biblical texts, specifically Jeremiah, and his creating a theology that, in effect, allowed Jews, both in Eretz Yisrael, but in the diaspora as well, to live in peace under a pagan empire, which was not what the prophets had promised when they were going to come back from Babylon. They were promised that they would, the Davidic kingdom would be restored, and when it wasn't, there was a crisis of faith, you might say. But Jeremiah had developed this idea that one could continue to live, one could live in the diaspora and wait for God to bring you back. And he actually got a prophecy right. He said 70 years, and that's exactly what happened when Cyrus the Great, after conquering the Babylonians, issued a decree allowing the Judeans to go back and rebuild the temple and reconstitute their religious life. Not only a certain percentage of them went, rebuilt the temple, but of course they were still under Persian domination. The Davidic kingdom was not restored. But this became, Jeremiah's idea, in effect, got transferred to the idea that there would be a future date in which the Davidic kingdom would be restored. In other words, the Messianic era, and therefore allowed the Jews to live in peace with the Persians, and subsequently to the Hellenistic and Roman empires. And really, it was the ruling Jewish ideology up until the 19th century, when, as a result of the growth of modern anti-Semitism, Jewish secular nationalism arose and developed a new idea of Jewish self-determination. Now, as I mentioned, there were only 4 times when there was a major revolt. There were smaller regional ones occasionally, but there was only 4 times when there was a major Jewish revolt against the ruling powers. The first one being the Maccabean revolt, which succeeded, but the subsequent revolts against Rome, 2 in Eretz Yisrael and 1 in the diaspora, were complete disasters. So, what you have to see in the war against Rome is a clash of these ideologies, where you have people, and we already looked at some of the material of the Sicarii and the Zealots, who believed, no king but God, and it was a sin to live under a pagan ruler, and it was better to die than to be a slave, versus this old established idea that God, if you are being ruled by the Romans, it's because God wants it that way. And therefore, to revolt against Rome is a sin. And you're going to lose because you're going against God's will. So the first time we see this really explicated is in Book 2 of the Wars, chapter 16. And it's found on page 743. And let me set the scene. This was right at the beginning of the outbreak of the war, and we'll be looking at it in more detail. But suffice to say that there had been some serious riots, and there was a real anger of the population, not just a small group, against the procurator Florus, who was incredibly corrupt and had, rather than calm things down, had stirred things up. And what happens is that because there was a massacre by the Roman forces, there was a great deal of dissatisfaction. They basically chased the forces out, and King Herod Agrippa II, the great-grandson of Herod the Great, the son of Herod Agrippa I, who, even though he was not king over Judea, he was still considered Jewish royalty, He had a palace in the city. He had been in Alexandria when everything had broken out. His wife Bernice was in Jerusalem, and she made a personal appeal to Florus to try to calm things down, which he didn't listen to. Agrippa came running back to the city as quickly as possible and joined with the high priests, the Sanhedrin, the high priests' privy council, and they tried to calm things down. They wanted to calm the people down. So what happens is that the people address the notables. Robert, if you could open the door, please. And they say, we want to send, we want to tell the emperor about how bad Florus is. They want to send ambassadors there about what all these horrible things that happened. And what happens is that there is a big public gathering. Bernice wasn't his wife, it was his sister. And he gives a speech to calm everybody down. And the speech begins on page 743, number 4, line 345. And this speech, which goes on for quite a while, we won't read all of it, it is something that Josephus was probably there and heard it. It doesn't mean that his account is word for word. In other words, not unusual in histories of this sort, going all the back to Thucydides, what you have are reconstructed speeches. So we would say that Josephus probably... Hang on one second, Paul. Don't move yet. Yeah, go ahead. Josephus is responsible for the final product of this speech, but it certainly represents, I'm sure it represents what Herod Agrippa believed, because Herod Agrippa was always against the war, and in fact later on, he sent troops to support the Roman army. So this is what you have to understand, which I think we talked a little bit about last time, is that this revolt was not, the subsequent revolt was not supported by everybody. There were significant Jewish populations that did not support this revolt. But Agrippa is now going to give a speech where he's going to try and convince the population of the stupidity and futility of revolting against Rome. And you're going to see he's going to employ a variety of rhetorical techniques and various kinds of facts to try and persuade the people that what they're doing is a very big mistake. So why don't we begin? Again, it's book 2 of the war, chapter 16, number 4, line 345. And if you've got this edition, it's at the bottom right corner of 743. So, Suzanne, you want to begin reading Herod Agrippa's speech?
Had I perceived that you were all zealously disposed to go to war with the Romans, and that the purer and more sincere part of the people did not propose to live in peace, I had not come out to you, nor been so bold as to give you counsel. For all discourses that tend to persuade men to do what they ought to do are superfluous, when the hearers are agreed to do the contrary.
In other words, if I thought you were all of one mind, I wouldn't even bother.
Right.
All right, go on.
But because some are earnest to go to war because they are young and without experience of the miseries it brings, and because some are for it out of an unreasonable expectation of regaining their liberty, and because others hope to get by it and are therefore earnestly bent upon it, that in the confusion of your affairs they may gain what belongs to, they may gain what belongs to those that are too weak to resist them. So, I have thought it proper to get you all together and to say to you what I think to be your advantage.
So he points out that there are people who have various motives for wanting to go to war, some of which are pretty base.
Right.
And the young people don't know what the miseries of war are like. Now, notice he talks about people who want liberty. This is a theme you're going to see that Josephus brings up, which undoubtedly was a strong element, but liberty probably meant the self-determination, the freedom to rule ourselves. And liberty is something the Romans would understand. If he's writing this for a Roman or a Greek audience, they understand people fighting for liberty. The Romans did it themselves. So that would be an understandable reason to revolt. Okay? But he's now going to tell you what he thinks is the right thing to do. Go on.
Okay, I have thought it proper to get you all together.
Excuse me one second. Everybody on the page, we're on Book 2 of the War, Chapter 16, number 4, and we're up to line 347.
Just about.
Yeah.
Okay. To say to you what I think to be for your advantage, that so the former may grow wiser and change their minds, and that the best men may come to no harm by the ill conduct of some others. And let not any one be tumultuous against me, in case what they hear me say does not please them. For as to those that admit of no cure, but are resolved upon a revolt, it will still be in their power to retain the same sentiments after my exhortation is over. But still my discourse will fall to the ground, even with relation to those that have a mind to hear me, unless you will all keep silence.
So you better listen to me, otherwise there's no point.
No
I mean,
hecklers.
the rhetoric here is very much done in a typical Greek, Latin, exhortatory kind of approach and style. All right, Irma, you want to pick it up? We're now again Book 2, Chapter 16, number 4. We're now on line 348.
I am well aware that many may make a tragical exclamation concerning the injuries that have been offered you by your procurators, and concerning the glorious advantages of liberty. But before I begin the inquiry, who you are that must go to war, and who they are against whom you must fight, I shall first separate those pretenses that are by some connected together.
Stop here for a second. So he says he's admitting the fact that the procurator has done some terrible things. Nobody disagrees on that. No, he's not going to defend Florus's actions, obviously. All right?
For if you aim at avenging yourselves on those that have done you injury, why do you pretend this to be a war for recovering your liberty? But if you think all servitude intolerable, to what purpose serve your complaints against your particular governors? For if they treated you with moderation, it would still be equally an unworthy thing to be in servitude.
So, in other words, he's saying, if this is to avenge what's happened to you, this is, why do you pretend this is for liberty? If this is for liberty, why would it be, why should you be moderate in your approach? So he's in effect saying, if you're for violence, you're for violence all the way. Okay? Go on.
Consider now the several cases that may be supposed, how little occasion there is for your going to war. Your first occasion is the accusations you have to make against your procurators. Now here you ought to be submissive to those in authority and not give them any provocation. But when you reproach men greatly for small offenses, you excite those whom you reproach to be your adversaries. For this will only make them leave off hurting you privately and with some degree of modesty, and to lay what you have waste openly.
See, there's a problem with what he's saying. It wasn't small complaints.
Yeah.
He's trying to minimize. He's trying to minimize it, but we're talking about really bad corruption and violence against the populations. So, if you skip a little further ahead, start reading from 352. But let us take for granted.
But let us take it for granted that the Roman ministers are injurious to you and are incurably severe, yet are they not all the Romans who thus injure you? Nor hath Caesar, against whom you are going to make war, injured you. It is not by their command that any wicked governor is sent to you, for they who are in the west cannot see those that are in the east. Nor indeed is it easy for them there even to hear what is done in these parts.
Stop for a second. Sam, do you know where we are?
I don't seem to be able to find it, but I'm listening.
Here, give it to me. I'll find it for you. All right. So what is he saying here? He's saying don't rebel against the emperor.
Yeah.
Who doesn't even know what's going on.
He doesn't know what's going on, right?
Yeah.
He doesn't know what's going on. So be very careful of what you are doing, because you will be perceived to revolt against the emperor. And at this particular point, I must say that he's not, the people who are, there's a mixed bag of people at this point, right? Mm-hmm. And most of them do not want to rebel against the emperor. They want to get Florus replaced. That's what they want, okay? That's really what they want, is to get Florus replaced. So we're right here. Give this back to Sam. We're right there at 352.
Thank you.
Okay. So, so what he's saying is that, because of this, he read a little further, 353. Now it is absurd.
Now it is absurd to make war with a great many for the sake of one, to do so with such mighty people for a small cause. And this, when these people are not able to know of what you complain. Nay, such crimes as we complain of may soon be corrected, for the same procurator will not continue forever. And probable it is that the successors will come with more moderate inclinations. But as for war, if it be once begun, it is not easily laid down again, nor borne without calamities coming therewith. However, as to the desire of recovering your liberty, it is unreasonable to indulge it so late.
Unseasonable.
Oh, unseasonable, to indulge it so late. Whereas you ought to have labored earnestly in old time, that you might never have lost it. For the first experience of slavery was hard to be endured, and the struggle that you might never have been subject to, it would have been just.
Okay, so stop there. What is he saying? He's saying that, this guy's not going to be procurator forever, right? And the next one will probably be better. But once you go to war, it's war. And that's going to be difficult to stop. The other interesting thing that he's hinting at, which is that, why are you revolting now after having been under Roman servitude for about 100 years? Why didn't you do it when you first were put under Roman rule? That would have been the time to revolt, right? And in the next point, he talks about how, when a slave is first made a slave, they're less likely to want to be a slave, but as time goes on, it doesn't matter. So if you look at 357, he says our ancestors and their kings were in a lot better shape to oppose the Romans than we are now. Okay? Then he goes through a whole series of historical examples of the Athenians and the Lacedaemonians, but the Spartans, who were conquered by the Macedonians, by Philip of Macedonia, who was Alexander the Great's father, and how they didn't revolt. So here are two great and powerful Greek nations who, when they were conquered by Alexander, did not revolt. You think you can revolt when the Spartans didn't revolt? All right? And he says, and then, of course, in 361, he talks about he says 10,000 other nations could revolt. So what makes you think you can do it? And look what he says. I'm going to pick it up where it says, what are the arms you depend on? Or what sort of army do you rely on? Yeah. This is line 361.
What sort of an army do you rely on? What are the arms you depend on? Where is your fleet that may seize upon the Roman seas? And where are those treasures which may be sufficient for your undertakings? Do you suppose, I pray you, that you are able to make war with the Egyptians and with the Arabians? Will you not carefully reflect upon the Roman Empire? Will you not estimate your own weakness? Hath not your army been beaten often even by your neighboring nations, while the power of the Romans is invincible in all parts of the habitable earth?
And what he then does is he has this long section of going through all the parts of the Roman Empire, mentioning all the nations that the Romans have conquered. It's a nice little summary of all the various parts of the empire, right? Yeah. He talks about the Gauls, the Germans, the Lycians, the Dacians, the Dalmatians. I mean, he just goes on and on and on and on, describing, how all the way over to Spain. And of course, the Germans are, were considered, the German tribes were considered particularly difficult, but how they, were tamed by 8 Roman legions. He even talks about the Britons. All right, how the Romans conquered the Britons and even the Parthians, which the Romans have been at war with for all this time. So, and he talks about, if you go over the next page to line 380, he says, now when almost all people under the sun submit to the Roman arms, will you be the only people that make war against them? And then he says, consider the fate of the Carthaginians. He's going back to the Punic Wars that the Romans had hundreds of years before against this other empire in the Western Mediterranean, the Carthaginians, and how the great general Hannibal, and how they even defeated them. So he's giving us a little history lesson about he talks about the Numidians, the Ethiopians, the Egyptians, and so on and so on and so forth. So if you skip over to page 747, line 390, this is where he's going to bring God into it. Cal, do you want to pick it up? It's on 747, line 390. What remains, therefore?
What remains, therefore, is this, that you have recourse to divine assistance. But this is already on the side of the Romans, for it is impossible that so vast an empire should be settled without God's providence.
Bingo. Right? If you truly believe that God is the God of the universe and everything is under God's control, then the Romans ruling over the entire world, essentially, is an act of God's providence, meaning God is causing this to happen.
The Jews themselves said that. In their, Jeremiah said that.
Well, that's the point from last. You weren't here right at the beginning, but where I reiterated it, that was Jeremiah's point. What Josephus has Herod Agrippa say. Again, could be either Josephus or, in fact, the actual speech of Herod Agrippa, and it wouldn't surprise me that this is a fairly accurate, representation of the speech, and Josephus was probably there to hear it. Somebody like Herod Agrippa, this is exactly what he would have thought. And certainly Josephus thought that. This is reflecting the traditional Jewish idea that Jeremiah first expressed, more than 500 years before this, and which the Jews had prospered under the Persians and most of the Hellenistic Empire, except for the Maccabean Revolt, and the Roman Empire. Now, for 100 years, they'd been under the Romans and prospered because they had, read on, Cal, reflect upon
it. How impossible it is for your zealous observation of your religious customs to be here preserved, which are hard to be observed, even when you fight with those whom you are able to conquer. And how can you then, most of all, hope for God's assistance, when, by being forced to transgress his law, you will make him turn his face from you? And if you do observe the custom of the Sabbath days, and will not be prevailed on to do anything thereon, you will easily be taken, as were your forefathers by Pompey, who was the busiest in his siege on those days on which the siege rested.
So, in other words, if you're so zealous for the keeping of the Torah,
you're going to lose.
You're going to lose because they're going to come and get you on Shabbat, which is how Pompey conquered Jerusalem, which is interesting because we always make the assumption that the Maccabees developed the idea that you're allowed to fight on Shabbat, pikuach nefesh, right? At least defend yourself, if not attack. Yeah. But he, in effect, is saying, you're not going to be able to do it. And he says, how can you then, most of all, hope for God's assistance if you're going to be forced to break the Torah? All right, but if in time of war
you transgress the law of your country, I cannot tell on whose account you will afterward go to war, for your concern is but one, that you do nothing against any of your forefathers. And how will you call upon God to assist you when you are voluntarily transgressing against his religion? Now, all men that go to war do it either as depending upon divine or on human assistance. But since you're going to war, we'll cut off both these assistances. Those that are for going to war choose evidence destruction.
So you're not going to be able to get human allies or divine allies, so you are inevitably going to destruction. And then, in effect, he's saying you're killing your own wives and children. Okay? So, and you know, he goes on for a little bit, warning them of the kind of slaughter that is going to go. And if you look at line 401, he says, I call to witness your sanctuary and the holy angels of God. Cal, pick it up there. In this country, common to us.
I call to witness your sanctuary and the holy angels of God and this country common to us all, that I have not kept back anything that is for your preservation. And if you will follow that advice, which you ought to do, you will have that peace which will be common to you and to me. But if you indulge your passions, you will run those hazards which I shall be free from.
Okay, and this speech is useless. And again, we'll get to that. He does not succeed in convincing them.
Well, who's actually reading this?
Well, first of all, the speech was given to the assembly in Jerusalem after some initial riots in which they chased the garrison out of the city, and they were literally on the verge of, you know, they wanted to send ambassadors to the emperor to tell them about Florus, but there were already people in the city who wanted to go a full-fledged revolt against Rome. It was a very volatile situation. He was with the sort of the main notables, the high priest, the Sanhedrin, to try and calm things down, okay? Because if they went further, they would be an open revolt. They could make a case to the emperor that they weren't revolting against the emperor's rule, only against Florus for his terrible practices, but they were on the verge of taking the step towards full revolt. And Herod Agrippa was trying to calm them down, and he did not succeed. Yes, Robert.
Do you think that this is Josephus making up a speech in the name of Agrippa to justify what Josephus subsequently does?
It's possible. It certainly is possible. It cannot be... in other words, did Herod Agrippa really do this? Well, we've only got Josephus's word for it, right? But it wouldn't be out of character for this to have happened, that the ruling group would have tried to calm things down. Whether Herod Agrippa did this kind of heroic speech in front of everybody, you're right. It might not have happened in the first place, and it could be, you know, Josephus trying to tell his readers, look, our leaders, our great leaders tried to stop this, but these brigands and zealots, and also, by the way, he's blaming Florus in all of this. He really puts the onus on Florus for causing the trouble, okay? But in effect, what he's trying to do is to project to his readers, you know, we didn't really, you know, at this point, we weren't against the empire. You know, there were men among us who knew it was futile.
I've been trying to get a feel for the man Josephus.
Yes, I understand, yeah. It's interesting.
And one of the things that staggers me
Yeah.
is his Catholic view and presentation.
What do you mean?
What happened? Universal.
Right.
He saw everything. He reports everything. Never mind, he's our only source. But you could have a source that's 6 pages long and our only source.
Right,
but
exactly.
It isn't only 6 pages long. It's huge. And what I'm trying to get from you, Rabbi, is do you think this is just him writing a story for himself kind of thing? Or do you think that there is more than just a vestige of accuracy
I think there's
in what we're reading?
I think it's quite plausible that Herod Agrippa could have done something like this. I think the speech itself, as it is now written, had to have been a composition by a reconstruction. Don't forget, he had Herod Agrippa help him with this work. In other words, he relied upon Herod Agrippa's first-hand accounts of many things, because Herod Agrippa was there also. So Herod Agrippa was one of his sources, because he became quite close friends with him in Rome when he was writing this. So it could very well be that, you know, he sat down with him and said, okay, let's reconstruct what happened. Don't forget, they're writing this more than 10 years later, the two of them.
You see, if you and I had been in Washington and heard Martin Luther King's speech,
Right.
but had not had photo documentation
And a
of it.
transcript.
And 10 years later, we sat down
Right.
to try and reconstruct it. What would, I mean, I assume, I think this man has a stunning intellect.
Yes.
Absolutely
Yeah,
staggering
absolutely.
intellect.
Yeah.
But, so I've been trying to work out, is this a fable?
No.
Or is this really?
I don't think
accurate?
I don't think it's a fable, Suzanne.
Well, my thought is that there must have been other people who had some knowledge of these events, so that if he was making it up, let's say out of whole cloth, he would have run into trouble. I'm
Yeah,
thinking
that's
he
true.
can't be the only one who knew about this stuff.
But also you have to understand the nature of history writing at the time was not unusual to reconstruct things like this. And later on, when when he gives us the speech of the head of the Sicarii at Masada, that's completely made up. He wasn't there. So, if you read Thucydides, for example, okay, Thucydides was, his history of the Peloponnesian War between the Athenians and the Spartans. I mean, it's a huge work, and by the way, it never completely got finished because it doesn't actually end with the end of the war. It's a huge work if you've ever read it. And there's all kinds of speeches that are given by various leaders, especially of the Athenians, that Thucydides probably wasn't there. So what did he do? He reconstructed certain things, may have even made up a few speeches, but that was quite common to historical writings. In other words, so we have to understand it's not like our historical writing, where if a historian made up a speech of somebody, they would say, how dare you do that? This was quite normal for them. So your answer is, Robert, it could actually be an account of a real speech, but the actual words may not reflect 100%. But also, think about it. Who did he say this work was for originally when he wrote it in Aramaic? The original Aramaic version of it, as opposed to the Greek version, who was it for? It was for the Jews of Babylon because they had recently come under the control of Rome. All right, Mesopotamia was conquered by the Romans from the Parthians, but only for a very short time. So the Jews of Babylonia, which were one of the biggest Jewish communities, were coming under Roman rule for the very first time. And so part of it could be, look what we did and look what happened. Don't you do that. I mean, there is some suggestions, if I'm remembering this correctly, that there was some resistance by the Jews of Babylonians to the Romans coming in, that they were resisting. So his original edition may have been sort of to say, look, one of our great leaders, one of our royal family told us not to do this, and look, we ignored him. Don't you make the same mistake. In terms of the Greek edition, I think he's trying to convince the Greek and Roman audiences that we weren't all, don't blame all of us for what happened. Because don't forget, this was, in terms of Roman history, it was a very serious thing, as you will see. The Romans suffered a lot of casualties in this war. They didn't come out of it. It was not easy for them to put this revolt down. Well, it took 8 years, first of all, okay?
It's like who would have thought the Americans could defeat the British?
Well, yeah, exactly. Only in this case,
They didn't.
we lost. Yes, Phyllis.
I was going to say, when you reconstruct something, it's an interpretation.
Yes, it absolutely
And,
is.
he emphasizes certain things and he minimizes certain things.
Yeah, exactly. So what exactly did Herod Agrippa say on that day? We will never know for sure, but I think the spirit of what he said is undoubtedly in this speech. Okay, so now let's take a look at something Josephus claims that he did. His own speech. And here, we're going to go to Book 5, Chapter 9, Paragraph 3.
Okay.
Page 857 in our edition. So again, it's Book 5, Chapter 9, on page 857, Paragraph 3, line 362. Now, I'll set this up for you. This is later on in the war. This is around the year, this is in 70, and it's when Titus has the city. It's the last stage of the war, aside from the fortresses like Masada, which came later. So it's in the year 70, page 857, Book 5, Chapter 9, line 362. So what's happened is that the city has been completely invested, and they were trying to
What
get,
does invested mean?
by the army, surrounded by the army. The Romans built a wall around the city to stop anybody from leaving. So they were trying to keep people in so they would starve. But Titus decided to try and see if they're willing to surrender. So he tries to, get them to surrender. And then he asks Josephus to go out in front of the walls and, speak to the rebels and try and see if he can get them. And it says, if you look in line 361, he said he tried to persuade them to surrender the city and sent Josephus to speak to them in their own language, for he imagined they might yield to the persuasion of a countryman of their own. Of course,
line is that?
that's on line 361, just above paragraph 3. Okay? So he figured, well, maybe they'll listen to Josephus, because he's going to speak to them in Aramaic and whatever. Of course, Josephus was considered a traitor by the rebels inside.
Right.
Okay? But let's look at what Josephus did. And in the first part is, he made sure that Josephus went to a place where he knew he couldn't get shot by arrows and rocks and various other things. And he certainly tries to get them to do it. So somebody want to, I think, Robert, it's your turn. Line 360. So Josephus went round the wall.
Went round about the wall and tried to find a place that was out of the reach of their darts, and yet within their hearing, and besought them in many words to spare themselves, to spare their country and their temple, and not to be more obdurate in these cases than foreigners themselves. For that the Romans, who had no relations to these things, had a reverence for their sacred rites and places, although they belonged to their enemies, and had, till now, kept their hands off from meddling with them. While such as were brought up under them, and if they be preserved, will be only the people that will reap the benefit of them, hurry on to have them destroyed. That certainly they have seen their strongest walls demolished, and that the walls still remain was weaker, and that those were already taken. That they must know that the Roman power was invincible, and that they had been used to serve them, for in that case it be allowed a right thing to fight for liberty that ought to have been done at first.
Okay, stop there for a second. His first point, of course, is that the Romans do not want to destroy the temple. They have great respect for the sacred precincts of other peoples. Again, he's trying to absolve, writing years later, he's trying to absolve the Romans for having destroyed the temple. Okay?
But the story of the Romans coming in and desecrating the temple.
That was in Pompey's time, okay? The fact is that this is a bit of exaggeration. All right? But now, the last part of what Robert read is similar to what was in the speech of Agrippa.
Right.
Okay, so read a little further.
But for them that have once fallen under the power of the Romans, and have now submitted to them for so many long years, to pretend to shake off that yoke afterwards was the work of such as had a mind to die miserably, not of such as were lovers of liberty.
Again, he's saying if you had wanted to be free, you should never have let the Romans in the first place.
Huh.
Go on.
Besides, men may well enough grudge at the dishonor of owning ignoble masters over them, but ought not to do so to those who have all things under their command. For what part of the world is there that has escaped the Romans, unless it could be such as are of no use for violent heat or violent cold?
In other words, the Romans are ruling over all the parts of the world that are worth ruling over. The rest are either too cold or too hot. Okay? But so you see, it's very similar to Agrippa's speech that he's giving. He's giving the same reasons, and now he's going to bring in God again.
Just before he does, as an editorial, I will point out that they never conquered Scotland. Hadrian's Wall was designed to keep the Scots out.
Well, they weren't Scots then; they were Picts. But actually, they did a second wall north of Hadrian's Wall that is in the area of what you now call Scotland, but south, I think, around just south of where Edinburgh is. So they did actually conquer, sort of, like after Hadrian, there was a second wall built some, 100 miles north, but they didn't hold it for very long.
The important thing is it was to keep the Picts out.
Exactly, and they didn't think it was worth it to go further.
Well, I don't think that's what the Scots would say. Right?
I'm sure they don't, but
And evident it is that fortune is on all hands gone over to them, and that God, when he had gone round the nations with his dominion, is now settled in
notice that, right? Fortune is now on the Romans, and it is God's, is in effect, is picked the Romans to rule.
That, moreover, it is a strong and fixed law, even amongst brute beasts as well as amongst men, to yield to those that are too strong for them, and to suffer those to have dominion who are too hard for the rest in war. For which reason it was that their forefathers, who were far superior to them, both in their souls and bodies and other advantages, did yet submit to the Romans, which they would not have suffered, had they not known that God was with them.
There, notice that?
Yeah.
It is the rule of nature that the weak must submit to the strong, and your ancestors in the days of Pompey, he's saying, are much stronger than you now, and yet they submitted, and they would not have submitted if they thought that God was with them. So he's reinterpreting the submission of the Judeans to the Romans as the realization that this is the hand of God.
As for themselves, what can they depend on is this their opposition, when the greatest part of their city is already taken, and when those that are within it are under greater miseries than if they were taken, although their walls still be standing.
You have to understand, Jerusalem had several different walls that were built, and the Romans had already taken the outer layers of the walls. So they were already occupying part of the city. The core of the city, which was the Temple Mount, and various and the area of that we would call the Jewish quarter today and Mount Zion, and there were various fortresses and palaces. What is now Jaffa Gate, there was a major fortress that was there, and a palace of Herod the Great. So that was kind of the core area, what we call the Old City today, plus. And the Romans had occupied the western suburbs and what was called the Second Wall. And there was a third wall that had never been completely finished. Herod Agrippa I had started to, there were suburbs of the city that had gone beyond the Second Wall. And Herod Agrippa had started building this massive third wall that actually, Josephus claims that if it had been finished, the Romans would never have taken it. And one of the things that is supposed is that the Emperor Claudius was rather shocked that his own friend, Herod Agrippa, was building this giant defensive wall around Jerusalem. For what reason other than to revolt? So that wall never got finished. And this is like more than 20 years later. So, you've already lost a big chunk of the city, and you're going to have famine. Anyway, we don't have to read the rest of it. He basically says, you should now surrender. It's going to be a lot better. And if you go to number 4, line 375, he says this. Let's pick it up again. Mike, you want to pick it up on 375, paragraph 4?
While Josephus was making this exhortation to the Jews, many of them jested upon him from the wall, and many reproached him. Nay, some threw their darts at him. But when he could not himself persuade them by such open good advice, a little editorial, he betook himself to the histories belonging to their own nation.
So he gives another talk. Go on.
And cried out aloud.
Notice that up until now, it's like he's reported his own speech in third person, and now he's going to first person, reporting. Go on.
Cried out aloud, O miserable creatures, are you so unmindful of those that used to assist you, that you will fight by your weapons and by your hands against the Romans? When did we ever conquer any other nation by such means? And when was it that God, who is the creator of the Jewish people, did not avenge them when they had been injured? Will you not turn again and look back and consider whence it is that you fight with such violence, and how great a supporter you have profanely abused? With a capital S. Will not you recall to mind the prodigious things done for your forefathers and this holy place, and how great enemies of yours were by him subdued unto you?
In other words, he's saying when the Jews had victory, it was because God had been with them, and it was really God that caused the victory. I mean, the Maccabees themselves, really, when you read the sources, said God was the one who brought about the victory here, not us. And that's reflected in the Al-Hanisim prayer. That's one of the oldest rabbinic accounts of Hanukkah, where it says, that it gives all the victory to God because the strong were defeated by the weak and the many by the few. That's like completely unnatural. So the only way that could have happened was by God. So if God is not on your side, and God is not on your side, you cannot win because you're going against God. And you've only ever won when God is on your side. You read a little further.
Did they also, God is not on your side because you sinned? Is that like when the prophets used to say that?
He's not really saying that. He's just saying that it was God's will that the Romans should rule.
He says if you look around at the
For
world,
whatever reason.
Yeah.
the Romans have got it.
Exactly. And the only way that could happen is because of God's will. And that's what Jeremiah said about the Babylonians and Nebuchadnezzar, right?
But he also said that the reason for that was because
Yes.
the Jews had
Yes.
sinned.
Yes. But he doesn't say that.
Yeah.
Go on.
Okay.
I even tremble.
Even tremble myself in declaring the works of God before your ears, that are unworthy to hear them. However, hearken to me, that you may be informed how you fight not only against the Romans, but against God himself.
Okay, and now he's going to give some historical examples from Jewish history. We'll read a little bit.
Okay, in all times there was one
Necho,
king of Egypt, who was also called Pharaoh. He came with a prodigious army of soldiers and seized Queen Sarah, the mother of our nation.
So he's going back to Genesis, the story of Abraham, when Abraham is forced to go to Egypt because of famine. Again, this is like reinterpreting the story.
A little bit.
Okay, and Pharaoh gets attracted to Sarah and brings her into his household. He's saying here, it's like, go on. What did Abraham, our progenitor, do?
What did Abraham, our progenitor, do? Did he defend himself from this injurious person by war? Although he had 318 captains under him, and an immense army under each of them. That's
an interesting midrash, which, if we go back to his recounting this in the Antiquities, we would find out what he actually, what he said. So he's claiming that Abraham had this vast army. He could have gone out against Pharaoh. Go on. Right. Indeed, he deemed them to be no number at all without God's assistance, and only spread out his hand towards this holy place, which you have now polluted, and reckoned upon him as upon his invincible supporter, instead of his own army. So and what he does after that is he talks about the slavery. He talks about the Exodus. Okay, he talks about he confuses the Assyrians with the Philistines and the story of Samson. Okay, if you go down to 386, he says, "It was God who then became our general and accomplished these great things for our fathers, and this because they did not meddle with war and fighting, but committed to him to judge about their affairs." Then he talks about Sennacherib during the time of Hezekiah and how his army was defeated in front of Jerusalem. And then notice what he says further on in 389 about how they were brought in slavery unto Babylon, where the people were captive for 70 years. Pick it up there, Mike. Yet were they not delivered into freedom again before God made Cyrus his gracious instrument in bringing it about. Accordingly, they were set free by him
and did again restore the worship of their deliverer at his temple.
So he knows his Bible.
Yeah.
And Cyrus is the instrument. I mean, it's, Cyrus is called that in the Hebrew Bible. In fact, Cyrus at one point is called God's Mashiach, God's anointed one. All right? So, he talks about how the Babylonians besieged the city, and then it says, and our king Zedekiah fought against him, contrary to what predictions were made to him by Jeremiah the prophet. So, in other words, because Zedekiah, did this terrible, stupid thing, which Jeremiah had said was not right, he was made prisoner, and, the city was destroyed. Okay, so he brings in the whole story of Jeremiah. And then if you turn over the page to line 394, he gives the example of the persecutions of Antiochus that started the Hanukkah revolt. Okay? And what happened there? In other words, that because of the sins of the people, Antiochus plundered the temple and so on and so forth. And then in 395, Jackie, do you want to pick it up there? What can it be said? This is on page 860,
Yeah.
line 395. You got it?
Excuse me.
You all right?
Yeah.
Okay.
What can it be that has stood up an army of the Romans against our nation? Is it not the impiety of the inhabitants? Whence did our servitude commence? Was it not derived from the seditions that were among our forefathers?
In other words, he's saying that the sins of our ancestors brought the Romans upon us. Read on. When the madness
of
Aristobulus and Hyrcanus
and our mutual quarrels brought Pompey upon the city, and when God reduced those under subjection to the Romans, who were unworthy of the liberty they enjoyed.
In other words, why did the Romans come in the first place? Because there was a civil war between the two of the Hasmoneans, Aristobulus and Hyrcanus. And he said the fact that they were fighting and this was a sin, and God therefore brought down Pompey upon us. Okay? And he then talks about Herod and why Herod was able to rule. Okay? So, in effect, he keeps going on and on about it. He harkens back again to King Hezekiah. And if you skip over to line 407, and it is plain madness.
And it is plain madness to expect that God should appear as well disposed toward the wicked as towards the righteous, since he knows when it is proper to punish men for their sins immediately. Accordingly, he broke the power of the Assyrians the very first night that they pitched their camp. Wherefore had he judged that our nation was worthy of freedom, or the Romans of punishment, he had immediately inflicted punishment upon those Romans, as he did upon the Assyrians when Pompey began to meddle with our nation.
And we can stop there. In other words, he said that if we were worthy, God would have come down and defeated Pompey, he would have defeated Sosius, he would have defeated Vespasian, he would have defeated Titus, okay? And so take a look on the next page, 412. This is really interesting what he says. Wherefore I cannot but suppose.
Wherefore I cannot but suppose that God is fled out of his sanctuary and stands on the side of those against whom he fights.
That is an incredible claim. But he's alluding here to what happens in the book of Ezekiel. When during the siege by the Babylonians, Ezekiel has a vision that the presence of God, the kavod, the holy living presence of God that dwells in the presence, flies away on his divine chariot so that it is no longer in the temple. In other words, when the sins of the people become so great, God will abandon his own sanctuary because of that. And he is in effect saying, God has abandoned his temple because of your sins in violating God's will by revolting against the Romans. That is a really strong claim on his part. And when God abandons his sanctuary, it opens it up to destruction. That's what happened the first time. It's going to happen again. Don't forget, he's writing this post facto. So in effect, what he is telling his Jewish audience is, our sins caused God to depart from the temple. Because if God had not departed from the temple, there's no way that the temple would have been destroyed.
Rabbi, we haven't read it, and we have your interpretation.
Yeah.
There's no question in your mind that the sin was to fight Imperial Rome.
The sin he traces back to the civil war between the Hasmonean brothers, but he's saying multiple things. In other words, he's not 100% theologically consistent. He's saying there's kind of this sin that happened, and that every time the Jews have sinned, a foreigner could come in and dominate them. And when they couldn't come in, then obviously God was on their side. So God was on their side at the time of King Hezekiah, who defeated the Assyrian army in front of Jerusalem. This is in the book of 2 Kings. God was not on our side when Nebuchadnezzar came. God was on our side when Antiochus, but not on our side. So God's not on our side now.
There is a scuttlebutt amongst the Orthodox.
Yeah.
That the sin which brings down the failure is a failure to adequately worship God.
Right.
As opposed, because the impression I'm getting from you is Josephus is saying the sin was to fight Imperial Rome. But that's not what the Orthodox are saying. It's
I know that.
Not pious enough.
Yeah, I know that. And he's shaping it for something that a Roman and Greek audience would understand. And also, he doesn't, because the Flavians are his patrons, he doesn't want to paint them in a bad way. What he is saying is that Vespasian and Titus are the servants and agents of God. So don't blame them. He never blames them for, by the way, when he gets around to discussing the destruction of the temple itself, he tries to absolve Titus of the responsibility for the destruction, even though we have another, like what happens is the night before the temple is destroyed, Vespasian has a council of war of his general staff, and they discuss whether to destroy the temple. And in the account that Josephus gives, Titus says, no, don't do it. And what happens is it's kind of like things got out of hand the next day. Okay. There's another account in a later, a fragment in a later, from a Roman historian that suggests of that same council that in fact Titus said, we've got to destroy it, and that the Romans did it intentionally because it was a source of, because it was the center that caused constant Jewish sedition.
Which makes more sense.
Well, yeah. So I think that in that particular case, Josephus was plainly trying to, because he became friends with Titus too. So, I mean, he's trying to absolve Titus of the responsibility for the destruction of the temple. But it's all part and parcel of this particular thing. Yeah.
But with the Romans, did Titus need any absolving in front of the Romans, or just from, I mean, the Romans wouldn't have opposed this, would they?
Well,
Why does he need to absolve Titus?
Don't forget, he's
Is
writing.
Sacrilege for everyone?
The Romans were extremely superstitious people, and the idea, of course, that you destroy a temple of a god is not a good thing. Not that they wouldn't hesitate to do it if they felt they had to, but
and that they would accept that there was a god of Judea, let's say.
There was a god of Judea, right?
I mean,
but
there
the
were
god,
lots
but
of
they're
gods.
exactly.
They did have a god there.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and the Romans did respect local religion. I mean, the Jewish religion was never outlawed in the Roman Empire. There was the persecutions of Hadrian, but nonetheless, that was a very, very short-term thing. Judaism was a legally established religion in the Roman Empire, and its practices were protected. So the destruction of the temple was an extreme act. The fact that they didn't allow the Jews to rebuild it, I mean, that caused a lot of resentment that led to the Bar Kokhba revolt later, 70 years later. Yeah, Irma.
No, I was just going to say, this is a very naive take on my part, but it would seem that rather than we aren't pious enough and therefore Israel has a problem.
Yeah.
Isn't there anything to be learned by all these internal fights?
Oh, yes, of course. Yes, of course. No, I mean, well, you can kind of do the what ifs. I mean, given the fact that this revolt was not supported by the general population, on top of which you have these internal fights between the various groups, killing each other while the Romans are at the gates, so to speak, there was no way this was going to succeed. I mean, if the entire nation had sort of banded together and everybody supported it, and but the only way they were going to win was if they brought the Parthians in.
No, I'm talking about today. I mean, with all
Oh yeah, of course. Yeah, no, I mean, yeah.
Learn from what happened.
Well, we don't. We don't learn. Yes.
It's also not coincidental that around this time, the covenant is being taken away from the Jews and given to the Christians, and that
Are you a secret Christian?
but that's what they say.
Yes.
Resulting
Yeah.
in the New Testament.
That's the later Christian interpretation of the destruction. Absolutely. Yes. But that's late. But that's later.
But even in the Apocrypha, they mention about how.
Which Apocrypha?
Esdras 2.
Uh huh.
I know that because I just kept
Right. Right.
He said that you Jews, or we Jews, he was Jewish too, he said, we blew it. It's not that God, in the old days, God would punish us and then forgive us. And no, you really blew it this time. God is taking his covenant away from you.
Oops. Wrong one.
Giving it to the real deserving people, namely the Christians.
Well,
That's what it says in the book.
Yeah, I know, but that's a book that got made into it was a Christian book.
It was written
Yeah,
clearly
absolutely.
after the destruction of the temple.
That's weird. I printed off the wrong thing. Okay, hang on. Let me just get find the other one. So we see where Josephus stood, and we can understand, therefore, his. We have to sort of see him as having divided loyalties in the time, not later on, but in the time. He's a loyal Jew, right? He's a member of the ruling class. So when the war really does break out, and the original provisional government, which is essentially his own a class of people, including the priests, are running the show, he joins in. But I would say his heart was never in it. I mean, the fact that he became this guy who was a Kohen became a general is in itself he must have had a natural ability, because he doesn't do a bad job in the Galilee given the circumstances. But I think that, he finally sees that this is not going to work, and he reverts to the position that his own ruling class believed in very strongly, and which was the traditional Jewish idea that the Romans are here because God wants them here. The reason why they ruled over us in the first place was because of our own sins. That if God had wanted us to be victorious and be independent, we would be, because we were in the past. God had defeated our enemies in the past when God was with us. But God's not with us now. God is with the Romans. I like the fact he says God's now basically living in Italy is quite fascinating. Like the weather there better? I don't know. The point is, it's fascinating, but his arguments are quite traditional. I mean, you can see how in the speech of Herod Agrippa and in his own speech, they bring in, of course, the very practical idea, who do you think you are to oppose the Romans? They've beaten everybody else. But the theological part, I think, is really the fascinating thing, that he is reflecting Jeremiah, and of course he even talks about Jeremiah. He's reflecting the theology that Jeremiah proposed to explain the Babylonian exile. Okay? And as I said, this is the ruling ideology of the Jewish people for the next almost 2,000 years. All right, we're going to just... Okay, so we're now going to come to the last part of our class, which is the war. And I'm going to send you a map that I found online of the war. I made a few copies that I'll just sort of hand around. You can all sort of look on briefly, because I couldn't make, they don't have a color printer here, and I can only make a few copies on my own printer. But I will send you, and the resolution's not great, but I will send this to you when I send you this material. So just sort of everybody sort of take a look at it and pass it on. What you've got here is a map of the various campaigns. And the first campaign, if you'll see on what it says is Gallus. This was the first one, and it's a solid red line that comes from the top down to Caesarea. Anyway, we'll take a look at that. But you just, if you follow that red line around, we will that will be the first thing that we'll really be looking at.
Solid red? The
solid one. It comes from the top down to Caesarea and then inland. Anyway. Okay. Now, back. So the question first is, what happened? In other words, why did the revolt break out? And if we go back to our original material, if you have the timeline with you, and if you don't, that's okay. I'll say what it is. It was the material from the first class, pages 1 and 2. What you have is that by the 60s, CE, the situation in Judea was deteriorating considerably. In other words, Herod Agrippa I, who was a grandson of Herod the Great and was a real, Jewish king, who ruled over, was granted by Claudius the emperor the entire territory of his grandfather, only ruled for a few years before he died. He ruled from 41 to 44. And then from there on, you had a series of procurators. Some of them were okay, like, believe it or not, Tiberius Alexander, Philo's nephew, wasn't a bad procurator. But starting in the late 40s, you actually had some really bad Roman. After Herod Agrippa's death, the Romans went back to direct rule of Judea, and the procurators, for the most part, were pretty bad. On top of which, also, they were changed with great frequency. In other words, earlier they had actually been around for longer periods of time. Under Emperor Tiberius, they'd been around. So what you had is under Nero, you had people who were really of a not high quality, who were basically getting the position because of political influence, and they were doing a terrible job. And in some cases, they were in fact, recalled. But you have, after Tiberius Alexander, who was the procurator for 2 years, from 48 to 66, which is 18 years, you have 4 procurators, and they're all terrible. Cumanus, during the time of Cumanus, between 48 and 52, the riots break out in Jerusalem. When Felix becomes the procurator, the Sicarii arise, and Jonathan the high priest is assassinated. And then when Festus becomes procurator, he doesn't do such a hot job. And then Albinus comes, and he's even worse. And then Florus becomes procurator in 64, and he's the worst of the lot. And so the pot has already been boiling, for years. And the fact that the community, had a, legitimate Jewish ruler for several years, and then it got taken away, would also have been something that would have really bothered people. So, the ones who were, sort of religiously against the idea of Roman rule. So, in the spring of 66, we have a series of events that leads to the breakout of a full-fledged revolt. These are not just local uprisings or riots or whatever, but it doesn't happen all of a sudden. So, what leads to it? It's first of all begins in Caesarea. And for here, we want to go to Book 2 of the Wars, chapter 14. Which is on page 738. Book 2, chapter 14. paragraph 4, line 284. So it's 738 at the bottom on the right side. Again, it's book 2 of the Wars, chapter 14, paragraph 4, line 284. And up until now, it's been talking about, he has talked about how terrible Florus is, and really spoke of him in really vicious terms. And now he's going to talk about the outbreak of riots at Caesarea. Now, Caesarea, which had been founded by Herod the Great and built by Herod the Great, and if you've been there, you know it's quite a huge. It was the Roman administrative center for the whole area. Jerusalem was the Jewish capital, but Caesarea was the Roman capital, and it was a mixed city. There were Greeks and there were Jews there. So it was a mixed city. Sam, do you want to pick it up now? At this time, it happened.
Now at this time it happened that the Grecians at Caesarea had been too hard for the Jews, and had obtained at Nero the government of the city, and had brought the judicial determination. At the same time began the war in the 12th year of the reign of Nero, and the 17th of the reign of Agrippa, in the month of Artesimus,
which is the month of Iyar. Now, the month of Iyar is April-May. I can't give you the exact date, but April-May of, like, middle of April to middle of May in the year 66. That's what you see on the sheet that I've given you. Okay, so that's what we're talking about here.
Now the occasion of this war was by no means proportionable to those heavy calamities which it brought upon us. For the Jews that dwelt at Caesarea had a synagogue near the place, whose owner was a certain Caesarean Greek.
Now, you have to understand, he's introduced the idea that the control of the city of Caesarea was the Greeks. So the Jews were a minority in Caesarea, but a sizable minority. So they had a synagogue, and the owner of the synagogue, however, meaning he was the owner of the property, which suggests the synagogue was not built as a separate building, but as, a building that was owned by this guy. Okay, read on. The Jews had endeavored
frequently to have purchased the possession of the place, and had offered many times its value for its price. But as the owner overlooked their offers, so did he raise other buildings upon the place in a way of affront to them, and made working shops of them, and left them but a narrow passage, and such as was very troublesome for them to go along to their synagogue.
So this guy was building on his property all kinds of other buildings, including workshops and things like that. So there was just this narrow entrance into the synagogue. And of course, the workshops would have been quite noisy and would have operated on the Sabbath and all kinds of things. Go on. Whereupon
the warmer part of the Jewish youth went hastily to the workmen and forbade them to build there. What is a warmer part of the Jewish youth?
Meaning the more radical or angry or, hotheads. Yes, excellent. Hotheads, yes.
But as Florus would not permit them to use force, the great men of the Jews, with John the publican, being in the utmost distress what to do, persuaded Florus with the offer of 8 talents to hinder the work.
So this guy John, was obviously the head, one of the heads of the Jewish community of Caesarea, and he goes to the procurator who has his headquarters in Caesarea and offers him an enormous sum of money to stop doing this. Go on. He then,
being intent upon nothing but getting money, promised he would do for them all they desired of him, and then went away from Caesarea to Sebast, and left the sedition to take its full course, as if he had sold a license to the Jews to fight it out.
So Florus took the money and did nothing. He went on vacation. Okay. Read on. Now on the next day,
which was the 7th of the week,
so the Sabbath, Shabbat,
when the Jews were crowding apace to their synagogue, a certain man of Caesarea of a seditious temper got an earthen vessel and set it with the bottom upward at the entrance of that synagogue and sacrificed birds.
In other words, he's doing pagan sacrifices on top of a large pot right in front of the synagogue on Shabbat.
This thing provoked the Jews to an incurable degree because their laws were affronted and the place was polluted.
Yeah, you can't worship in a place that's been turned into a pagan sanctuary. Go on.
Thereupon the sober and moderate part of the Jews thought it proper to have recourse to their governors again, while the seditious part, and such as were in the fervor of their youth, were vehemently inflamed to fight.
So the older, the sober rulers of the community said, okay, we got to go back to the government. The hothead youth said, no, we're going to fight it out. Go on.
The seditious also among the Gentiles of Caesarea stood ready for the same purpose, for they had by agreement sent a man to sacrifice beforehand, as ready to support him, so that it soon came to blows. Hereupon Jacundus, the master of the horse, who was ordered to prevent the fight, came thither, and took away the earthen vessel, and endeavored to put a stop to the sedition. But when he was overcome by the violence of the people of Caesarea, the Jews caught up their books of the law, and retired to Narbata, which was a place to them belonging, distant from Caesarea 60 furlongs.
Now, Jacundus was probably, one of the local military commanders of a detachment of cavalry, and he was meant to keep the peace. He was like a police force, so he was trying to stop what these Greeks were doing. But the Jews, took their Torah scrolls and they go to Narbata and to set up shop there. Yeah, Suzanne.
The use of the word sedition, which he uses for both sides, is this just in the sense that they are fighting when they're not allowed?
Yeah, in other words, it's civic violence, which the authorities would just not want.
Because I think of it as usually a more serious.
Yeah, I'd have to go back and look at the Greek. I mean, again, this is an old translation, but I mean, it's violence. It's like rioting, basically. We're talking about here. Go on.
But John and 12 of the principal men with him went to Florus, to Sebast, and made a lamentable complaint of their case, and besought him to help them, and with all possible decency put him in mind of the 8 talents that they had given him, reminded him. But he had the men seized upon and put in prison, and accused them for carrying the books of the law out of Caesarea.
So instead of, calming things down, he makes things worse by throwing the whole delegation of the very people who are trying to keep the peace into jail. Okay. Phyllis, do you want to pick it up there, line 293?
Moreover, as to the citizens of Jerusalem, although they took this matter very ill, yet did they restrain their passion. But Florus acted herein as if he had been hired, and blew up the war into a flame, and sent some to take 17 talents out of the sacred treasure, and pretended that Caesar wanted them.
So Florus makes things a hell of a lot worse. He goes and raids the temple treasury, which is a complete act of sacrilege, for the enormous sum of 17 talents, pretending it was a tax that Nero had put upon the Jews. And of course, what happened in Caesarea would quickly be known to the people in Jerusalem, and they get pretty upset about it, but at the moment they were just willing to let things get worked out. Go on.
At this, the people were in confusion immediately, and ran together to the temple with prodigious clamors, and called upon Caesar by name, and besought him to free them from the tyranny of Florus.
Notice, they were making, if Josephus claims they were not attacking Nero, or the emperor himself for being the ruler, but were, attacking Florus. Go on. Some also of the seditious.
Some also of the seditious cried out upon Florus, and cast the greatest reproaches upon him, and carried a basket about, and begged some spells of money for him, as for one that was destitute of possessions and in a miserable condition.
So, in other words, they were doing this public street theater where people were going around with baskets begging for Florus because he obviously needs the money. Well, this is, a public insult to the Roman procurator. Go Go on.
Yet was not he made ashamed hereby of his love of money, but was more enraged and provoked to get still more. And instead of coming to Caesarea, as he ought to have done, and quenching the flame of war, which was beginning thence, and so taking away the occasion of any disturbances, on which account it was that he had received a reward of 8 talents, he marched hastily with an army of horsemen and footmen against Jerusalem, that he might gain his will by the arms of the Romans, and might, by his terror and by his threatenings, bring the city into subjection.
So he's, again, Florus seems to be incapable of handling the situation, and Josephus blames him for making the matter worse and worse and worse. So now he's bringing a small army to Jerusalem. There already is a garrison there in the fortress called Antonia, which was right on the northeast corner of the Temple Mount. There are some archaeologists, if you go through, you can see some bits of it that still exist. But things are just getting worse. Read on.
But the people were desirous of making Florus ashamed of his attempt, and met his soldiers with acclamations, and put themselves in order to receive him very submissively.
In other words, they were not trying to stop it. They were trying to calm things down. But he sent Capito,
a centurion, beforehand with 50 soldiers, to bid them go back and not now make a show of receiving him in an obliging manner, whom they had so foully reproached before, and said that it was incumbent upon them, in case they had generous souls and were free speakers, to jest upon him to his face, and appear to be lovers of liberty, not only in words, but with their weapons also.
In other words, he's provoking them, in effect saying, he's egging them on to fight. Go on with this message.
With this message was the multitude amazed, and upon the coming of Capito's horsemen into the midst of them, they were dispersed before they could salute Florus, or manifest their submissive behavior to him. Accordingly, they retired to their own houses, and spent that night in fear and confusion of face. Now at this time, Florus took his quarters at the palace, and on the next day he had his tribunal set before it, and sat upon it, when the high priests and the men of power, and those of the greatest eminence in the city, came all before that tribunal, upon which Florus commanded them to deliver up to him those that had reproached him, and told them that they should themselves partake of the vengeance to them belonging, if they did not produce the criminals. But these demonstrated that the people were peaceably disposed, and they begged forgiveness for those that had spoken amiss.
So you get the scene. He sets up a tribunal. The leaders of the city come to him to beg forgiveness for this public disgrace of him. And he's asking that those people be surrendered to him, otherwise the notables will suffer the consequences of it. Again, he's not calming things down. Every action is getting it worse and worse. Go on, for it was no wonder.
For that it was no wonder at all that in so great a multitude there should be some more daring than they ought to be, and by reason of their younger age, foolish also, and that it was impossible to distinguish those that offended from the rest, while everyone was sorry for what he had done, and denied it out of fear of what would follow.
So nobody would admit to doing it.
That he ought, however, to provide for the peace of the nation, and to take such counsels as might preserve the city for the Romans, and rather, for the sake of a great number of innocent people, to forgive a few that were guilty, than for the sake of a few of the wicked, to put so large and good a body of men into disorder.
So he should have just forgiven them, and that would have been the end of it. But that's not what happens. Well, we'll do a little more.
Florus was more provoked at this, and called out aloud to the soldiers to plunder that which was called the upper marketplace, and to slay such as they met with. So the soldiers, taking these exhortation of their commander in a sense agreeable to their desire of gain, did not only plunder the place they were sent to, but forcing themselves into every house, they slew its inhabitants. So the citizens fled along the narrow lanes, and the soldiers slew those that they caught, and no method of plunder was omitted. They also caught many of the quiet people, and brought them before Florus, whom he first chastised with stripes, and then crucified.
So he let his soldiers, see, it was, one of the ways soldiers got paid was, if they had laid siege to a city, they were allowed, when they captured the city, to go in and plunder it, and to do whatever they want for a certain period of time. So Florus's troops are now let loose as if they had just captured Jerusalem after a siege. So they do what soldiers do. They went plundering and they went murdering. But even worse, people were brought to Florus and he had them flogged and crucified as if they were rebels, because that was the Roman punishment for that. We'll just finish the rest of this. Accordingly, the whole number
of those that were destroyed that day with their wives and children, for they did not spare even the infants themselves, was about 3,600.
So there's this massacre of 3,600 people by Florus's soldiers over this whole incident. Go on.
And what made this calamity the heavier was this new method of Roman barbarity. For Florus ventured then to what no one had done before, that is, to have men of the equestrian order whipped and nailed to the cross before his tribunal, who, although they were by birth Jews, yet were they of Roman dignity notwithstanding.
Jews of Roman citizenship who were of the equestrian class, which is what the procurator himself was, which is one step below the nobility. They were recognized by the Romans to be of this higher class, were flogged and crucified. Okay? So this is what causes the outbreak of the war. Things just go completely downhill from there. We'll continue with it tomorrow. I've given you on this sheet charting the first year of the war. Next week I'll give you the outline of the rest. We're obviously not going to read the whole thing about the war. I want to read a little further about what happened that led to the formal beginning of the war. And the initial, I don't want to read all of the initial campaign of Cestius Gallus, but certainly the Battle of Beit Horon, which was highly significant. And then we'll, because then what happens is that after the Romans are chased out, when Cestius Gallus is defeated at Beit Horon, the Romans essentially depart from the whole area, and Nero appoints Vespasian, who doesn't come back to the area for at least 6 months. In other words, he spends a whole period of time preparing himself, and the war doesn't really resume until the spring of 67. So there's a period from late 66, from like October, November, until the spring of October, November of 66, until the spring of 67, where the Romans are completely out of the whole territory, and that's when the Jews, appoint Josephus to be commander of the Galilee, and they start, building up their forces and, getting ready. Yes, Rob.
I have two comments.
Yeah.
First of which is, I feel as though these first 7 lectures have merely been the preamble, and if there is a vote for the next session, it is I would like to move on to Gotterdampen.
Okay. Well, let me.